The corridors of the prison station were cold and silent, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, the kind that made every step echo like a hammer on steel, the kind that whispered that no one ever left this place alive. Deep in that metal labyrinth, a single human was dragged forward by two alien guards, wrists chained, back bruised, blood crusted on the side of his face, his head hanging low but his eyes open, silent and steady. They had beaten him, starved him, stripped him of everything except the one thing they couldn't touch, his will. The guards laughed as they dragged him through the hallway, their voices full of arrogance, because they thought humanity was finished. They thought this man was nothing but a broken relic from a forgotten war. They didn't know what they were truly holding. Every cell they passed was filled with the noise of other prisoners, soft whispers, quiet breathing. No one dared make a sound louder than that. Everyone knew what happened to those who made noise here. This station was where the council sent things to disappear: criminals, rebels, soldiers, and one human who no one remembered. At least they thought no one did. They shoved him into a small cell with rusted bars and old lights that flickered like dying stars. Chains locked to the floor clamped around his ankles and wrists. He didn't fight them, he didn't scream, he just sat down slowly, and when the guards left, his lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile, because he knew something the rest of the galaxy didn't. Silence is not weakness, silence is the space before the storm. Far above the station, among the asteroid fields, a small smuggler ship hovered without its lights, its engines on low power. 6 aliens crowded around the cockpit, nervous and whispering. Their captain stared at the station's blinking lights through the viewport and said, "Are you sure about this?" Another answered, "Yes, the intel's clean, they've got a Terran in there." And the room fell silent for a heartbeat, because the word Terran still carried weight even after so many years. "No one saves humans," one of them muttered. "Not unless they want trouble." The captain smiled, a thin, sharp smile. "That's exactly why we're going to do it." He didn't say it out loud, but deep down, every smuggler in that room felt it too. Saving a human wasn't just a job, it was playing with fire, and if they were caught, the council wouldn't just kill them, they'd erase their entire existence. But greed and curiosity were stronger than fear tonight. Their ship drifted closer, hidden by the station's blind spot, a trick only smugglers and pirates knew how to use. Inside the prison, the human sat still, listening to the faint vibration in the walls, the low hum of a ship approaching, and he knew. Someone was coming. Not for him, perhaps, but for what he represented. In the security tower, alien officers sat bored at their consoles, tapping their claws against the metal, laughing about bets on how long the human would last before dying. None of them noticed the faint pulse on their radar, a pulse masked under thousands of decoy signals. None of them noticed the small external hatch opening in one of the docking tubes, and none of them saw the smugglers slipping in like shadows. The crew moved fast, silent, wearing black suits with signal dampeners, their boots making no sound on the steel floors. They had bribed an informant to learn the layout, and now they were walking through the corridors with a single goal. Get the human. Get out. Get paid. One of them, a tall insectoid named Tress, whispered, "Why would anyone pay this much for a human?" The captain whispered back, "Because Terrans are dangerous." And dangerous meant valuable. Meanwhile, in his cell, the human slowly raised his head, eyes locking onto the security camera in the corner. His gaze calm, controlled, unbroken. The kind of gaze soldiers have when they know something no one else does. The smuggler team reached the security hub, disabled the alarms with a code chip, and sliced the door to the detention block open. One guard looked up too late, a blade slid through his throat. Another tried to sound the alarm, but a stun bolt hit his chest and dropped him before his finger touched the button. They moved like they had done this 100 times, efficient and cold, until they reached cell 43. The captain stood in front of the human, looked at him, and whispered, "We're here to get you out." The human didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything. He just stared at the captain for a long, silent moment, then nodded once. The captain hesitated for half a second, because something in the man's eyes made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't a prisoner. This was a loaded weapon. They cut the chains, opened the cell door, and led him into the corridor. But the moment he stepped out, the station changed. Lights flickered. Systems glitched. Doors slammed shut. The captain cursed. What the hell is happening? Tress checked his scanner. Something tripped the call. We've got 5 minutes before lockdown. The human's expression didn't change, but inside, his heartbeat matched the rhythm of something old buried deep in the stars. As they moved toward the exit hatch, alarms finally screamed through the station, red lights flashing, guards pouring out of corridors with rifles ready. Blaster fire tore through the metal air, the smugglers ducked behind cover, firing back, but the human moved through the chaos like he'd done it 1,000 times, every motion fast and precise. He disarmed a guard with his chain still wrapped around his wrists, snapped another's neck like it was nothing, grabbed a fallen weapon and fired with calm accuracy, hitting every target like he was born for war. The smugglers looked at each other, realization hitting them. They hadn't rescued a prisoner, they had unleashed something far bigger. They reached the hatch, bullets and plasma bolts ricocheting around them. The captain hit the launch sequence on his wrist pad. The ship's engines roared awake outside, and the airlock door opened with a hiss. The human turned at the last second and stared down the corridor filled with alien guards who had once laughed at him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any threat. The hatch closed. The smuggler's ship detached from the station and jumped into the dark, leaving the alarms screaming behind. But the moment their ship crossed into the black void, something else happened. All across the galaxy, encrypted Terran channels that hadn't spoken in years lit up like stars flaring to life. A signal moving through the void faster than light, carrying only coordinates and one line of Terran code. It wasn't a distress call. It was a summons. Deep in the void, far beyond the edge of mapped space, ships that had been sleeping began to move, black engines humming to life, wolf emblems glowing faintly against the darkness. The smugglers thought they had saved one man. They didn't know they had just woken an empire. And the galaxy didn't know it yet. But tonight, a single prison break had lit the match that would burn everything. The smuggler's ship cut through the void like a silent blade, its engines dimmed to avoid detection, its hull still warm from the chaos they had left behind at the prison station. Inside, the crew was breathing hard, their hearts pounding as the alarms from the escape still echoed in their minds. They thought the hard part was over, but they had no idea what they had just set in motion. The captain gripped the controls tight, sweat rolling down his neck as the stars streaked by. His second in command, a small reptilian pilot, kept checking the scanners over and over again, terrified of being followed, terrified of what they had done. But the human sat at the back of the ship in silence, staring at nothing, his wrists still bruised from the chains, but his posture straight, calm, controlled, like a soldier waiting for orders that were already written. One of the smugglers finally broke the silence, his voice shaking a little. "Why is he so quiet?" The captain didn't answer because he didn't know either. There was something in the human's eyes, something cold and sharp, like looking at a storm before it hits, not wild but planned, patient, inevitable. They had smuggled weapons before, fugitives, war criminals, even stolen tech. But this was different. This man didn't look like someone who had been rescued. He looked like someone who had been waiting. Far away from their small ship, on the dark edges of the galaxy where the light of the Council's stars no longer reached, something old stirred. Hidden relays flickered to life, long-dormant codes were activated, encrypted signals leapt across space like wolves leaping from shadow to shadow, unseen and unstoppable. Fleets that had slept for years in the black began to hum with power, not because the human had called them, but because he didn't have to. He was the signal every Terran vessel had been programmed to recognize the return of one of their own. On the smuggler's bridge, alarms flashed as the pilot shouted, "We're picking up something strange," background noise on every channel. The captain leaned over the console, his eyes narrowing. "That's not noise," he muttered, "that's a network." The human finally stood up, every head in the room snapping toward him as if an animal had moved in a room full of prey. He didn't look afraid or confused. He just walked toward the viewport and stared into the stars as if he could see something coming that no one else could. Then he spoke for the first time since they freed him, his voice low and steady. "They're already moving." The room went silent. The smugglers exchanged uneasy glances, because no one had asked who they were, but every one of them suddenly knew. The Council had tried to bury Earth a long time ago, but they hadn't buried their reach. In the depths of the void, massive Terran dreadnoughts began waking, one after another, systems lighting up like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, their wolf emblems pulsing faintly, and though none of the smugglers could hear it, The entire void was echoing with an old Terran war code. A call not for help, but for retribution. Back on the bridge, the captain swallowed hard and said, "We need to dump him." The reptilian pilot turned in shock. "What? We can't just throw him out into space." But the captain hissed back, "If the council tracks us with him on board, we're dead. If the Terrans track us with him on board, we're worse than dead." The crew froze at that thought, because everyone in the galaxy had heard stories about Terrans, about what happens when one of their own is touched, how entire fleets vanish, how worlds burn, how their silence is the warning before the storm. None of them had believed those stories were real, until now. And then the scanners started flashing red. Not because something was chasing them, but because something was moving through space that shouldn't have been there. Massive spikes in dark energy signatures flickered in and out, too fast to track, too precise to belong to any council fleet. The captain leaned over the display and whispered, "What the hell is that?" But the human, still staring at the stars, answered in a calm voice, "They are here." The ship shuddered as something passed through the edges of their sensors, a ripple of power so strong the lights dimmed for half a second. The reptilian pilot screamed, "We're being scanned." But no council technology could have scanned them from that far. The Terrans could, because they had built the void. The captain shouted, "Shut everything down. Now!" The engines powered off, the ship drifting in cold silence. But the human didn't move, he didn't need to, because the Terrans already knew where he was. In the void, black dreadnoughts slipped through space like ghosts, their wolf symbols glowing brighter as they synchronized into hunting formation. They didn't need to broadcast or make demands. They were already coming, and nothing could stop them. On the council's outer listening posts, operators stared at their screens as unidentified signals flooded their scopes. One by one they went pale as they recognized the pattern. One whispered, "No, not them," before his screen went dark. The council hadn't seen Terran fleets in decades, but no one forgot their shape, no one forgot their silence. On the smuggler ship, the crew argued in whispers, panic creeping into their voices. One of them shouted, "We're dead because of him," pointing at the human, but he didn't flinch. He simply turned, his gaze sharp and cold, and said, "No. You're alive because of me." The way he said it made every word feel heavy, like the truth had just stepped into the room. Outside, in the void, one Terran dreadnought appeared in sensor range, then another, and another, until the stars around them were swallowed by black hulls. Ships so large and silent it felt like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The captain felt the blood drain from his face. "This is impossible," he whispered, but the humans simply walked to the viewport, watching the fleet take position around them. The wolves had come for one of their own. What the smugglers didn't know was that from this moment on, the entire galaxy would shift, borders would break, fleets would burn, and all because they freed a single human. They thought they were smugglers running from the law. In truth, they had become the center of a storm. The Terran fleet was awake, and the stars themselves trembled. The smuggler ship floated in the void like a leaf caught in a silent storm, surrounded by shadows so massive they swallowed entire constellations. The Terran fleet had fully revealed itself now, one dreadnought after another appearing from the darkness, no flashing lights, no blaring horns, just an endless black wall of metal and power stretching farther than the smugglers could see. Every hull bore the same glowing wolf emblem, a cold white mark that burned like a scar across the stars. The crew sat frozen on the bridge, staring through the viewport with wide eyes and dry mouths. None of them dared to move, dared to speak, because in that moment they understood what kind of storm they had stumbled into. This wasn't a fleet, it was a judgment waiting to fall. The reptilian pilot whispered, "This can't be real," his voice shaking, but the captain didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands gripped the edge of the console so tight his knuckles were white, his heart hammering in his chest. He had seen pirate armadas, council war fleets, even ancient relic ships, but nothing, compared to this. These ships didn't move like anything built by the galaxy. They moved like predators in perfect sync, not loud, not messy, but with the precision of something that didn't need to prove its power. At the back of the bridge, the human stood tall now. The quiet prisoner was gone. His presence filled the room like gravity. His eyes focused on the flagship in the distance, a massive dreadnought twice the size of any other, its wolf emblem blazing like a star. He didn't say a word, but the crew could feel it. The fleet wasn't just here by accident, it had come for him. Suddenly the entire ship vibrated with a soft pulse, a signal wave passing through it like a ghost touching the hull. All systems flickered, the scanners overloaded, the navigation display went black for a heartbeat before flashing with a new reading. They hadn't been destroyed, they hadn't been boarded, they had been claimed. The ship was now locked inside the Terran Fleet's formation, not by force, but by something worse, control. A calm, deep voice filled the bridge through the ship's comm system, speaking in Terran language, a language no one had heard spoken in decades. Its sound was soft but carried the weight of a hammer falling, asset recovered. Stand by. The captain looked at the pilot, at the smugglers, all of them shaking, asset. One of them whispered, their voices barely audible. The human didn't even flinch. He just turned his head slightly, the faintest ghost of a smirk on his lips. He knew this voice, this tone. This was not a rescue, this was a return. The captain hissed, "Who are you?" Finally voicing the fear burning in every corner of the ship. The human looked at him, calm, steady, like a soldier remembering the battlefield. "The reason they don't sleep easy at night," he said, and it sent a cold wave through every smuggler's spine. Outside, the flagship shifted its position, engines glowing faintly like the breath of something ancient waking. Small hunter ships detached from the main formation, moving in perfect silence toward the smuggler ship. Their black hulls sliding through the void like blades. The pilot screamed, "They're coming right at us." But there was nowhere to run. The human placed a hand on the captain's shoulder, his grip strong, unshakable, and said, "Don't fight." In the Council's outer defense network, alarms exploded across dozens of systems as unidentified energy spikes lit up every sensor. Technicians scrambled, commanders shouted, ships were deployed. But nothing they did mattered, because every attempt to track the Terran fleet ended the same way. Silence, as if the void itself swallowed their signal whole. A council operator whispered to her superior, "They're moving," and the commander froze in place, his eyes wide. "God help us," he muttered, though no gods ruled the void, only wolves. Back on the smuggler ship, the hunter craft surrounded them like a tightening noose, their formation so precise it made the smugglers' sloppy flight paths look like children drawing with shaking hands. One of the hunter ships extended a black docking tube, attaching to their airlock with a hiss so soft it made everyone's stomach tighten. The captain raised his blaster with shaking hands, but the human just shook his head slowly. "If you fire," he said, his voice low and steady, "you'll die. Before you blink." The airlock opened without resistance. Terran soldiers stepped inside, black armor gleaming under low light, their helmets marked with the same wolf symbol. Their steps synchronized like a single living machine. They didn't shout, didn't give warnings, they simply filled the ship with their presence. The smugglers raised their weapons out of fear but knew in their bones it wouldn't matter. These weren't soldiers, they were predators. One of the Terran soldiers stepped forward, scanned the human with a small device, and nodded once. No words exchanged, just understanding. The lead soldier turned to the rest of the crew and spoke in perfect galactic common. His voice cold, "You will not be harmed. You will follow." The captain tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The human walked forward on his own. No chains now, no hesitation, like a man returning home. The Terrans formed a corridor around him as they led him off the ship, their steps so quiet it felt like shadows moving. The moment he crossed into the flagship, the smuggler ship's lights flickered back to life. Their systems no longer locked but tagged with Terran signatures. Not enemies, not allies, just witnesses. As the Terran fleet turned, the smuggler crew watched through the viewport as hundreds of dreadnoughts aligned in perfect formation. Engines glowing brighter, the void bending around them like a storm about to be unleashed. The captain whispered to himself, "We should have left him there." But deep down, they all knew it was too late for regrets. Across the galaxy, Council outposts received a single repeating message from the void, transmitted on an ancient Terran frequency that hadn't spoken in 100 years. It said only 4 words. "One of ours taken." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And the galaxy understood exactly what that meant. The Terran fleet began to move through the void like a living storm, silent, coordinated, unstoppable, thousands of black dreadnoughts aligned in flawless formation. Their engines glowing faintly like cold fire, their wolf emblems burning against the darkness like the eyes of predators hunting in a moonless night. The smuggler ship drifted behind the formation under escort of hunter craft, their crew staring through the viewport in speechless terror. They had never seen anything like this before, no council fleet, no pirate armada, No war machine in history moved with such precise, surgical calm. This wasn't a military maneuver. This was a ritual, an old, perfected dance the galaxy thought it would never see again. On the Terran flagship, the human walked down a long steel corridor, the walls humming softly with the vibration of massive engines. Terran soldiers stood in lines along the hall, helmets black, faces hidden, not a sound leaving their ranks, and yet their presence filled the air like the weight of a thunderstorm. He walked past them without hesitation, his boots echoing like the slow beat of war drums, every soldier turning their heads slightly to acknowledge him, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. The captain of the smuggler ship sat in his chair, fingers digging into the armrests, sweat dripping down his neck. "They're not just coming for him," he whispered, "they're coming for something else." But none of his crew replied. They couldn't. Their eyes were fixed on the endless sea of Terran ships unfolding around them. In council space, the alarms were already screaming. Relay stations on the border transmitted incomplete sensor readings. Fleets scrambled without orders. Messages flooded high command. One word repeated over and over: Terrans. Admirals shouted for calm, senators demanded answers, but no one had any, because no one had ever seen this scale of mobilization. Not since the war a century ago, and back then, even at their height, the Terrans hadn't moved like this. This was different. This wasn't war. This was personal. On the flagship, the human entered the command bridge, a vast chamber layered with dark steel and glowing tactical screens. The floor slightly tilted like the prow of a ship made for cutting through space. At its center stood the fleet commander, tall, broad, his armor matte black, no insignias except the wolf etched on his chest plate. He turned as the human entered, no words spoken, just a nod, a gesture shared only by soldiers who had already bled together. And the bridge crew snapped to. "Attention. You've been found," the commander said in a calm voice that rolled through the bridge like distant thunder. The human didn't ask how or why. He simply answered, "Then they've already made their last mistake." The commander's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Not joy, not cruelty, but the recognition of a hunt finally beginning. Across the void, the Terran fleet accelerated, entire star systems flickering off scanners as they passed through, their stealth tech turning their movement into ghost trails. Border patrols sent out desperate alerts before going silent one by one. The Council's communication grids buzzed with frantic voices. "We've lost Sector 12, we can't track them. They're inside the border. How are they inside the border?" And then the messages cut, leaving static. In the Council's war room, the High Speaker slammed his hand against the table, claws scratching metal. "One human," he roared. "This is all for one human." But the old generals, the ones who had fought the Terrans before, just stared at the flashing red lights on the star map, their faces pale, because they knew the truth. The Terrans didn't need an army to start a war. One was enough. One was always enough. Back on the flagship, targeting overlays came online. Tactical screens mapped entire sectors in seconds. Terran hunter fleets were already ahead of the main armada, striking silently at sensor relays, supply depots, and communication stations, cutting the galaxy's throat before it even realized a knife was pressed against it. Not a single transmission came back, not a single distress call made it through. Every node fell into silence, like the void itself swallowing the galaxy piece by piece. The captain of the smuggler ship whispered, "They're erasing them." His voice barely audible, his hands trembling, and he wasn't wrong, because the Terran fleet wasn't here to invade. They were here to dismantle, to punish, to make the Council feel helpless before the hammer fell. On the bridge, the commander turned to his officers. "No broadcasts," he said, his voice cold. "No warnings, no messages. We don't speak." The human standing beside him stared out into the stars, his expression calm, steady, unreadable. But inside his chest the old fire burned again. The fire that had been buried under chains and darkness, and now it roared like a storm about to consume the sky. The Terran dreadnoughts jumped into hyperspace one sector at a time, their formation unbroken, their precision terrifying. Fleets that tried to intercept them were swallowed in seconds. Entire squadrons disappeared without a trace. Council commanders screamed for reinforcements, but nothing answered, because every reinforcement fleet was already gone. The Terrans weren't fighting battles. They were erasing them. On a border station, an alien officer watched in horror as black ships appeared outside their perimeter. No lights, no sound, no warning, just the wolf emblem staring back at them through the void. and before he could even scream, the station went dark. The Terran fleet was a blade sliding through soft flesh, and the galaxy had no armor left. The High Speaker tried to rally his people, tried to convince himself this was just a show of force, but deep down, beneath every political speech and every shouted command, he felt it too, the cold, crawling truth. Humanity wasn't coming to negotiate. They were coming to collect. And they had been waiting a very long time to do it. The wolf had returned to the galaxy, and the hunt had begun. The storm finally reached the border systems, but it didn't sound like a storm, it didn't roar or scream, it came in silence, like a shadow swallowing light. The Terran fleet moved through council space with a precision no other empire could match, not leaving trails, not giving warnings, just striking with surgical perfection. One moment border stations were reporting in, their officers laughing nervously about ghost readings, and the next moment they were gone. Not destroyed in massive battles, not shattered in long wars, just gone, like the void had opened its jaws and swallowed them whole. On the Council's main star map, entire sectors blinked out in waves, communications cut. Defense fleets vanished without a single distress signal. Panic spread through the command centers like fire racing across dry wood. But there was nothing they could do because they weren't fighting a war. They were already losing it before it even started. In orbit of one of the border worlds, the Terran dreadnoughts appeared like mountains rising from the black, massive, silent, terrifying, their wolf emblems burning white in the darkness. Their formation wrapped around the planet like a steel cage. Council warships scrambled to intercept, but their targeting systems failed the moment the Terrans came into range. Their scanners filled with static. Their comms jammed by codes they couldn't even begin to understand. The first wave of Council ships opened fire blindly, plasma bolts flashing into the void, hitting nothing, and then the Terrans answered, not with a storm of fire but with a single strike. One dreadnought opened its rail batteries. The shot didn't explode. It just erased a cruiser like it had never been there. Then the next ship disappeared, and then the next, one after another like dominoes falling in absolute silence. On the ground, civilians looked up at the night sky as their fleets vanished without a sound. Whispers spread through cities, fear crawled through the streets like a living thing. Everyone had heard stories about Terrans, stories the Council had called myths, stories about black ships and wolves that hunted in the stars. No one had believed them. But now those stories stood over their world, real, merciless, unstoppable. In the Council war room, generals screamed over each other. Deploy everything to Sector 7. Get the high fleets moving. Where are the reinforcements? But every reinforcement fleet they called was already gone, ambushed, erased. The Terrans were ahead of them at every turn, moving faster than their intelligence, striking where no one expected and leaving nothing behind but silence. The High Speaker slammed his hand on the table, his voice shaking with anger and fear. This is madness. This is over one human. But the old admiral standing at the corner finally spoke, his voice low, hoarse, steady. No. This is not about one human. This is about what happens when you touch something that belongs to them. On the Terran flagship, the commander stood at the front of the bridge, watching as holographic star maps updated in real time. Enemy fleets vanishing one after another. The human stood beside him. No chains now, no weakness. His presence felt like a spear cutting through the dark. The commander said, "They're folding faster than expected," and the human replied, "Fear moves faster than fleets," and he was right, because entire systems were surrendering without a single shot being fired. Planetary leaders broadcasting surrender codes in every language, begging to be spared. But the Terrans didn't respond. They didn't need to. Silence was louder than mercy. The smugglers who had rescued the human were still aboard their small ship locked in Terran formation. Their captain staring at the destruction unfolding on his screens, his hands shaking. "We caused this," he whispered. His pilot didn't answer. Because what could you say when the galaxy's deadliest fleet moved for a man sitting a few meters away? In a distant Council sector, 3 entire fleets gathered to make a stand. Thousands of ships lined up in tight formations. The largest defensive force the Council had assembled in decades. Admirals shouting orders, soldiers whispering prayers. The High Speaker called it their iron wall. And for a brief moment, people believed they might hold the line, but belief died the moment the Terrans arrived. The first sign wasn't an explosion but a shadow. The stars behind the defensive wall disappeared as the Terran fleet emerged like a black tide. Hunter ships flanking dreadnoughts, carriers sliding into position, their formation tight and cold. The Council opened fire with everything they had. The void lit up with thousands of plasma beams, missile trails, energy bursts. But the Terran fleet didn't break formation. Their counterfire came a second later. Not loud, not desperate, just perfect. Clean, surgical, wave after wave of precision strikes tearing through the Council's iron wall like it was made of glass. Entire capital ships blinked out of existence in seconds. Command ships split in half before they could issue retreat orders. In 10 minutes, what was once the strongest fleet in the galaxy was nothing but burning wreckage floating in silence. In the Council chamber, the High Speaker watched the live feed with his claws digging into the table. His voice breaking into a whisper, "It's not a war," and the old admiral beside him nodded slowly, "No, it's a message." Across the galaxy, Terran dreadnoughts descended on every major route, choke point, and defense network, not screaming their arrival, not demanding surrender. They simply appeared, and every time they did, the enemy vanished. The wolves had returned not to negotiate, not to conquer, but to remind the galaxy of what it had tried to bury, and every star system they touched learned the same truth. Once the Terrans begin to hunt, there is no escape. The galaxy was cracking, not with the sound of explosions, but with the weight of fear. Every Council world that once mocked Earth now trembled under black skies filled with Terran dreadnoughts. Fleets that once felt untouchable were gone. Defense stations were silent. Communication relays burned out like dead stars. Entire sectors that once took decades to fortify had been dismantled in hours. The Council wasn't losing a war. They were being dismantled like prey trapped in a hunter's teeth. Their leaders had built their empire on fear, but they were learning what it meant to face something that had perfected fear into a weapon. Their fleets were built to fight loud wars, wars of control, but the Terrans didn't fight loud wars. They erased them. On the flagship, the humans stood at the center of the observation deck, watching the star map fill with red lines vanishing one by one. Every Council defense collapsing like sand under the tide. The commander stood beside him, his arms behind his back, calm, steady, watching the inevitable unfold. "They're falling faster than expected," one officer said, her voice almost disbelieving. "They're not even resisting anymore." The commander didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had seen this before. The way fear spreads through empires like a disease. The way a single spark can burn 1,000 thrones. "That's because they understand," the human said quietly. "They took one of ours. That's enough." The officer lowered her gaze, because she knew what that meant. Every soldier in the fleet knew. When one of their own was taken, the Terrans did not negotiate. They did not bargain. They did not threaten. They hunted. Across the Council's inner worlds, panic grew like a living storm. Streets were filled with citizens staring up at skies now painted black by Terran ships. Entire governments crumbled without a single Terran soldier setting foot on their soil. Their leaders ran to bunkers, to war rooms, to their fleets. But there was nowhere left to run, because the wolves were already everywhere, no matter how many borders the Council drew. No matter how many lines they claimed to defend, the Terrans moved. Through them like shadows, they were already inside. At the last fortified choke point before the Council's capital, a massive fleet waited, thousands of warships in perfect formation. The last wall between the Terrans and the seat of power, admirals screamed orders, soldiers prepared to die, propaganda blared through channels about courage and glory, but beneath the speeches, fear pulsed like a heartbeat, because everyone who had fought Terrans before knew what was coming. The first sign wasn't a sensor ping or a warning alarm, it was the stars going dark. The Terran fleet dropped out of the void like a black curtain being drawn across the sky. Their formation so tight, so silent. It felt like the night itself had swallowed the fleet whole. No transmissions, no hails, no mercy. The Council fired first. They always did. Plasma beams cut through space, missiles screamed across the black, energy weapons streaked like lightning. And then, all of it disappeared into Terran point defense. Every missile intercepted, every beam absorbed, every strike made meaningless, and then the Terrans answered. It wasn't a barrage. It wasn't chaos. It was a single, coordinated strike, thousands of dreadnoughts firing at once with terrifying precision. Every shot hitting its mark like the galaxy itself had betrayed the Council. Flagship after flagship broke apart in seconds. Battlecruisers exploded silently into drifting wreckage. The admiral on the lead Council ship tried to give a retreat order, but before the words could leave his mouth, the Terran flagship locked onto his bridge and erased it with a single railgun shot. No warning, no flare. Just gone. Within 15 minutes, the Council's last great fleet was nothing but debris floating in silence. On the ground, billions watched the sky as the glow of their fleet's destruction lit the horizon. Some screamed, some wept, but most just stood still, too terrified to move, because they understood something primal. This was not war. This was punishment. In the council chamber, the High Speaker collapsed into his chair, his claws digging into the metal as he whispered, "We had walls, fleets, alliances." But the old admiral beside him stared at the burning sky and said, "Walls mean nothing to wolves." The room fell silent as the last sensor feeds came in. Nothing left, no fleets to rally, no allies to call, just the Terran Armada slowly moving closer to the capital world. One formation after another wrapping around their system like the jaws of a beast closing on its prey. On the Terran flagship, the commander stared at the burning remnants of the last council fleet on the tactical display. "It's over," one officer said, but the human beside him shook his head slowly, his eyes cold, steady, unblinking. "No," he said, "it's just the beginning." The commander didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. This was bigger than a war. This was the answer to a century of silence. This was the moment the galaxy remembered what it had tried to forget. The Terran fleet advanced slowly, methodically, like a storm swallowing everything in its path, and no one dared to stand in their way. The wolves were home. The sky above the council capital was no longer a sky, it was a graveyard made of shadows. Terran dreadnoughts filled the orbit like a black tide, their hulls blotting out the stars, their wolf emblems glowing cold and merciless like eyes of predators circling a wounded beast. The last of the council's fleets was gone. Their last defense lines had collapsed like paper against steel, and now, the wolves had come to stand over their prey. The streets below were silent. Millions of civilians stood in open plazas, on rooftops, in military bunkers, staring at the dark ships hanging above them like a storm that didn't need to roar. Their entire world was caged, every jump lane locked, every comm channel jammed, every satellite under Terran control. There was no escape and no hope, only the cold weight of judgment pressing down on the capital. In the council's war chamber, senators screamed, generals shouted, but their words were meaningless now. Their grand empire had shattered, their fleets had vanished, their borders meant nothing. The High Speaker sat at the center of it all, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on the massive holographic display of orbit where Terran ships moved like one living creature. "This can't be happening," he whispered, but it was. It was happening just as the old stories said it would. The wolves had been silent for 100 years, but silence was never peace, it was patience. On the Terran flagship, the commander stood before the viewing window, the capital world hanging beneath them like prey trapped in a hunter's teeth. Around him officers worked in perfect rhythm, not loud, not frantic, just efficient, calm, relentless. This wasn't a moment of celebration, it was execution. Centuries of waiting had led to this single night, and everyone on that bridge knew it. The humans stood beside him. No longer a prisoner, no longer a forgotten soldier, but something far more dangerous, a symbol. The moment he stepped aboard this ship, the galaxy's fate had been sealed. All council fleets neutralized, an officer reported, planetary defenses offline, civilian networks under our control. The commander nodded once, his voice low, steady, begin Phase 7. Outside, the Terran dreadnoughts shifted in perfect silence, their formation tightening around the planet, their engines glowing faintly like the breath of some ancient beast, and then a single pulse swept through the fleet, not a broadcast, not a demand, just a silent wave, and the entire planet's power grid shut down in less than 5 seconds. Cities that once glittered with light and arrogance plunged into darkness. Panic spread like blood in water. People screamed, sirens wailed, soldiers ran, but it didn't matter, because the wolves had already closed their jaws. In the war chamber, lights flickered, systems failed, comm links died, and for the first time in centuries the mighty council felt what it was like to be powerless. The High Speaker stood, his voice breaking, "They won't stop here, they'll burn everything." But the old admiral, his face pale and hollow, whispered, "No, they don't need to burn anything. We're already dead." Across the capital, massive defense towers powered down, rail cannons went offline, fleets of automated drones dropped out of the sky like flies hitting glass. The entire planetary defense grid was being eaten alive by Terran code. ancient systems buried under the Council's infrastructure. The kind built when humanity still walked among them, had been waiting, dormant, ready to turn against their masters the moment the wolves returned. The smugglers, still trapped inside their ship under Terran escort, watched it unfold from orbit, their captain gripping the armrest so tight his claws bled. "They're not attacking," he whispered, his voice shaking, "they're just taking it." And he was right. The Terrans didn't need to invade, they didn't need to fire, they already owned everything. A single transmission suddenly cut through the void, not to the Council, not to the armies, but to everyone. A voice carried on every frequency across the capital world. Clear, calm, human. "We warned you once," the voice said, "you didn't listen." It wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. In the streets, people froze as the message echoed from every speaker, every screen, every device. That voice wasn't loud, it didn't scream, it didn't boast, it simply carried the weight of something inevitable. The wolf emblem appeared in the sky, projected across the night like a scar burned into the heavens, and every person below understood. The Council's reign was over. On the flagship, the commander turned to the human. Their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. This wasn't about war anymore. This was about memory, about making the galaxy remember what it had done and what it had feared. "They will beg," the commander said quietly, "and we will not answer." The human didn't smile, he didn't flinch, he simply said, "Good." In the council chamber, senators argued, some screamed to surrender, others begged to flee. But the high speaker just stared at the emblem above the planet, his hands trembling. "We threw them into the void," he whispered, "and they learned to live there." His words fell into the room like stones sinking into deep water. No one argued, because it was the truth. The Terran dreadnoughts held position, thousands of ships casting their shadow over the capital world like night that would never end. No fire, no bombs, no fleets descending, because the wolves didn't need to bark when the prey was already broken. The galaxy had feared this day for a century, and now it had arrived, silent, merciless, absolute. The hunt was almost done. The end didn't come with a roar, it came with silence, a silence so deep it crushed the air from the lungs of everyone on the council capital world. Above the planet the Terran Fleet hung like a black crown, thousands of dreadnoughts floating in perfect stillness, their wolf emblems glowing like cold fire, their formation surrounding the world so tightly that the stars themselves seemed caged behind them. The mighty council that had ruled the galaxy for centuries was now nothing more than a trembling voice beneath their shadow, their fleets gone, their allies silent, their systems broken, their pride shattered. The galaxy had called them the greatest empire in history. But tonight it learned what true power looked like, and it did not scream, it did not gloat, it simply stared down like a predator over its prey. On the ground, entire cities had gone dark, power grids stripped, defense networks devoured by Terran code. The once bright capital was now nothing more than a trembling mass of lightless towers. The people gathered in streets and plazas, staring at the black sky above, at the massive ships hanging like gods they had mocked a century ago. The panic of hours ago had given way to something worse, a quiet, choking fear, the kind that doesn't make people run. It makes them kneel. In the council chamber, the high speaker sat slumped in his chair, his eyes hollow, his claws digging into the metal of the table. Around him senators argued and screamed, but their voices no longer carried any meaning. No matter what they said. The wolves were already at their door and the galaxy knew exactly how this would end. He whispered, "This was never a war," and the old admiral beside him, the last living officer who had fought the Terrans in the old war, gave a hollow nod. No, this was their return. A soft tremor ran through the chamber as a transmission signal hit the capital's networks, not from the council, not from some distant fleet, but from the Terran flagship itself, a single frequency hijacking every channel, every speaker, every screen on the planet. The wolf emblem appeared over every surface like a brand burned into the sky, and then came the voice, the same human voice that had spoken once before, calm, steady, cold. "This is what happens," it said, "when you touch what is ours." There was no shouting, no threats, no declaration of war, just those words, simple and final, and the entire galaxy heard them. Every surviving fleet, every neutral world, every system still pretending to be untouched, they all heard the verdict. On the flagship, the commander stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the trembling world below. Phase 8 complete. An officer reported, Their voice steady but quiet, no one celebrated, no one cheered. Because there was nothing to celebrate. This was not a victory. This was a reckoning. The human stood beside the commander, his posture calm. His eyes locked on the capital, the place that had chained him. The place that had mocked his people. The place that now kneeled beneath the wolves. His voice was low. They thought we were gone. The commander replied, they were wrong. In orbit, hunter ships moved with surgical precision, disarming the last hidden defense satellites, seizing control of comm towers, locking every jump lane in the system. The Council's capital was no longer a capital. It was a cage, a reminder, a warning carved into the heart of the galaxy, one that would never be forgotten. Across the planet, broadcasts changed. The Council crest that had flown over every city for generations dissolved into static, replaced by the glowing wolf emblem, projected into the night sky, onto every building, every screen, every soldier's visor. There was no anthem, no flag raised, no troops marching in, just silence, the kind of silence that tells a story louder than any war cry. In the plazas, civilians fell to their knees as the voice echoed again. We warned you once. And in that single moment, the mighty council broke, not with battles, but with fear. Their leaders knew they were no longer rulers, they were prey. On the council chamber floor, senators began to beg, some screamed for negotiations, others for mercy. But the High Speaker didn't speak. He stared at the wolf emblem burning above the sky, the emblem that had haunted every rumor for a century, and whispered, we should never have touched them. His voice cracked and hollow. The old admiral closed his eyes, because he knew what came next, not fire, not slaughter, but something worse. A memory carved so deep that the galaxy would never dare again. On the flagship, the commander gave a single nod, the order passing silently through the fleet, and the Terran dreadnoughts began to move away, one by one. Their engines glowing faintly as they turned from the broken world. They didn't bomb it. They didn't claim it. They didn't build on it. They just left it in silence, because they didn't need to stay. They had already done what they came to do. Across the galaxy, every empire, every fleet, every leader felt the same chill crawl down their spine, because they understood the message. The Terrans hadn't returned to conquer, they had returned to remind, to make the stars themselves remember who they were. The wolves that the galaxy had thrown into the void had not died. They had sharpened their teeth in the dark, and now they owned the silence. As the last Terran dreadnought slipped into the void, leaving the Council capital on its knees, the galaxy took its first breath in hours, not out of relief, but out of fear, because everyone knew this night would never be forgotten, not for 1,000 years. The wolves of Earth had returned, and every star knew now what happens when you touch what belongs to them.